June 5, 1944, 2300 hours. RAF North Witham Airfield, England. Private First Class Leonard Legs Griffing checked his parachute straps for the 5th time, his hand steady despite knowing what the next 12 hours would bring. Around him, 45 other men from Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, performed the same nervous rituals, adjusting equipment, checking weapons, trying not to think about the fact that German military doctrine declared what they were about to attempt was tactically impossible. Griffing had read the intelligence briefings. He knew what German generals had concluded after their costly victory at Crete in 1941. Large-scale airborne operations were obsolete. The casualties were too high, the landing zones too scattered, the troops too vulnerable during descent and immediately after landing. German Fallschirmjäger, elite paratroopers, had captured Crete but suffered such devastating losses that Hitler forbade any future major airborne operations. The price of victory was too high. General Oberst Kurt Student, architect of the Crete operation and father of German airborne forces, had written in his post-battle report, "The era of large-scale parachute operations is over. The defenses have evolved faster than the tactics. Parachuters descending from aircraft are helpless targets. Upon landing, they are scattered, disorganized, and vulnerable to coordinated counterattack by defenders who maintain organization and firepower superiority. Future airborne operations should be limited to small-scale commando actions. Anything larger invites catastrophic casualties for minimal territorial gain." This assessment wasn't just German opinion. British airborne operations at Trigino Aqueduct and Bruneval had been small-scale raids, not major assaults. Soviet airborne drops behind German lines in 1942–43 often ended catastrophically, with entire units destroyed or captured within days. By 1944, the military consensus was clear. Small-scale airborne raids could work for specific objectives, but large-scale airborne assaults were tactically obsolete. The defenses had evolved: better anti-aircraft weapons, more sophisticated coordination, radio communications allowing rapid response. Dropping thousands of paratroopers into defended territory would result in massacre, not victory. The U.S. Army disagreed, not from arrogance, but through systematic analysis of what had worked and what hadn't. American planners studying Crete and other operations identified that casualties came from predictable patterns: landing on heavily defended areas, poor dispersion reducing surprise, insufficient planning for rally and organization, lack of heavy weapons support, and delayed link-up with ground forces. What if you designed an airborne operation that avoided these failures? What if you deliberately scattered troops across a wide area to create confusion and multiple threats? What if you trained paratroopers to operate independently until they could link up? What if you equipped them with weapons capable of fighting armor? What if you planned the operation as part of a larger assault where seaborne forces would relieve paratroopers within hours, not days? The result was Operation Neptune, the airborne component of D-Day. It would be the largest test of airborne warfare ever attempted, and its success or failure would determine whether airborne forces had a future in modern warfare. The human preparation. The men boarding C-47s on June 5th represented the most extensively trained soldiers America had ever produced. Becoming a paratrooper was voluntary. Soldiers had to volunteer for airborne training, knowing that it would be more dangerous than regular infantry service. The standards were rigorous. Training began at Jump School, Fort Benning, Georgia, where soldiers learned parachute operations through progressive training. Week 1, physical conditioning that eliminated roughly 30% of volunteers. Week 2, tower training using 34-foot and 250-foot towers. Week 3, aircraft procedures and emergency training. Week 4, 5 qualifying jumps from C-47 aircraft. Those who earned their jump wings faced additional training with their assigned units. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions conducted realistic exercises, simulating combat jumps, night operations, and independent action behind enemy lines. Soldiers learned to operate without resupply, to find and rally with scattered comrades, to achieve objectives with whatever forces were available. The equipment each paratrooper carried represented careful planning to maximize combat effectiveness while minimizing weight. Basic load, M1 Garand rifle or M1 carbine, 200 rounds ammunition, grenades, entrenching tool, first aid kit, rations for 3 days, and personal equipment. Many soldiers carried additional weapons, bazookas, machine guns, explosives, strapped to their legs or packed in equipment bundles, dropped separately. The total weight often exceeded 100 pounds, more than most soldiers' body weight. Men loaded with this equipment had to climb into aircraft, sit for hours during flight, then jump and parachute to Earth, carrying loads that would cripple them if they landed wrong. The physical demands were matched by psychological challenges. Jumping from a perfectly good airplane at 500 feet in darkness over enemy territory, knowing German anti-aircraft fire would be seeking your transport, that you might land in trees or water or directly on enemy positions, that you might be separated from your unit. This required a particular mindset. Lieutenant Richard Winters, commanding Easy Company, 506th PIR, addressed his men before boarding. "We've trained for 2 years for this moment. You know your jobs. You know your objectives. Remember, we jump scattered, but we fight organized. Find any officer, any NCO, any trooper, and form a fighting unit. Every German position you knock out, every bridge you hold, every crossroad you control makes the beach landings easier and saves lives. The plan gives each company specific objectives, but the mission is simple. Cause chaos, hold key terrain, link up with the invasion force. Do that, and we win." The fleet takes flight. At 2300 hours, June 5th, the first C-47s began rolling down runways across southern England. The armada that formed in the darkness represented American logistics and coordination at peak efficiency. 822 C-47 transport aircraft from 9X Troop Carrier Command, carrying 13,000 paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Another 512 gliders would follow, carrying jeeps, artillery, medical supplies, and additional troops. The flight plan was meticulously choreographed. Aircraft formed in 9-ship V formations called serials, each serial carrying one company. The serials flew in trail, following lead aircraft equipped with navigation aids. The route took them over the English Channel at 1,500 feet, then descending to 500 feet for the drop over Normandy. 500 feet, low enough to minimize time paratroopers were vulnerable during descent, high enough to allow parachutes to deploy safely. The altitude left no margin for error. If pilots misjudged height or speed, soldiers could die from malfunctioning parachutes or hard landings. The flight across the channel took approximately 2 hours. In the darkened C-47s, paratroopers sat in silence or talked quietly, checking equipment repeatedly. Some slept despite the tension. Veteran soldiers had learned to grab rest whenever possible. Others prayed, wrote last letters, or simply sat with thoughts too personal to share. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton, commanding 3rd Battalion 506th PIR, moved through the aircraft speaking to soldiers. "You're the best trained, best equipped troops in the world. You're jumping into history. Whatever happens in the next hours, know that you're doing something no army has ever done at this scale. You're the tip of the spear that's going to free Europe. Be proud, be careful, be aggressive. I'll see you on the ground." At 2100 hours, June 5th, the first green lights began flashing in C-47s across the fleet. "Go, go, go! Jumpmaster's shouts, barely audible over engine noise and anti-aircraft explosions. Men shuffled toward open doors and threw themselves into darkness. Private First Class Burgett, 506th PIR, described his jump. The plane was twisting, diving, climbing to avoid flak. The green light came on. I jumped into nothing, couldn't see ground, couldn't see other chutes, just tracers and explosions. The opening shock felt like getting hit by a truck. Then silence, except for distant gunfire and explosions. I looked around, alone, no other chutes visible. I was somewhere over Normandy with no idea where. The jump zones were supposed to be clearly defined areas where entire units would land in concentrated groups. Reality was far different. The combination of scattered aircraft, varying altitudes and speeds, and pilots releasing paratroopers early or late to avoid flak meant soldiers landed across an area roughly 25 by 15 miles. Some landed in their assigned zones, many landed miles away. Some came down in the flooded marshes near the Douve River, deliberately inundated by the Germans as a defensive measure. Weighted down with equipment, several men drowned in water only 4 feet deep before they could cut free from their parachutes. Others landed in trees, on buildings, in the middle of German positions. Private John Steele of the 505th PIR landed on the church steeple in St. Mère-Église, his parachute catching on the spire. He hung there for 2 hours, playing dead, watching German soldiers shoot other paratroopers as they landed in the town square below. He survived only because Germans eventually assumed he was dead. The casualties during the drop and landing were significant but not catastrophic. Of the 13,000 paratroopers who jumped, approximately 1,500 were killed, wounded, or captured in the first hours, a 12% casualty rate. This was serious, but far less than the 30% losses Germans suffered at Crete. The real question was, could scattered, disorganized troops accomplish their missions? The rally, organization from chaos. The airborne plan had accounted for dispersion. Every soldier carried a small metal cricket, a children's toy that clicked when squeezed. 1 click was the challenge, 2 clicks the response. In the darkness of Normandy, thousands of scattered paratroopers clicked their way toward each other, forming small groups that grew into effective combat units. Leadership emerged at every level. Officers who found themselves with soldiers from different companies formed ad hoc units. NCOs who couldn't find their officers took command. Private soldiers who found themselves alone moved toward sounds of fighting or rallied with any American they encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding 3rd Battalion 506th PIR, landed 2 miles from his drop zone. He gathered 180 men, less than half his battalion, many from other units. At 4:30 a.m., this improvised force attacked St. Mère-Église, the first French town liberated on D-Day. They cleared German defenders, established defensive positions, and raised an American flag on the town square by 500 hours. The mission had called for the entire battalion to take the town by 300 hours. They were late, under strength, but successful. The missions across the airborne area showed similar patterns. Units rarely had full strength or proper organization, but they accomplished objectives through initiative and aggressive action. At Lafayette Bridge over the Merider River, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin Vandervoort landed with a broken ankle. He command-crawled to rally his men, led an attack on the bridge, and held it against German counterattacks throughout D-Day despite his injury. Near Utah Beach, small groups of 101st Airborne soldiers took crossroads, knocked out coastal gun batteries that could have devastated landing forces, and created such confusion the German commanders couldn't organize effective responses. The chaos the German doctrine predicted would destroy airborne effectiveness actually worked in American favor. German defenders faced attacks from multiple directions by forces of unknown size. Radio reports from different sectors reported American paratroopers everywhere. German commanders couldn't determine the main threat or coordinate effective responses because Americans were scattered across the entire area, creating multiple simultaneous crises. Generalleutnant Wilhelm Folly, commanding the 91st Infantry Division, was killed by American paratroopers while driving to investigate reports of landings. His death at 0600 hours on D-Day, killed by scattered paratroopers who shouldn't have been able to coordinate effective action, symbolized how American airborne operations succeeded despite or because of the chaos. The objectives: mission accomplished. By noon on D-Day, American paratroopers had achieved most critical objectives despite landing scattered and under strength. The missions that German doctrine said were impossible had been completed. St. Maria Glees, captured and held, securing the western flank of Utah Beach. Lafayette and Chef du Pont bridges, seized and defended, preventing German armor from reaching the beaches. Causeways behind Utah Beach. 4 of 5 causeways secured, allowing troops from the beach to move inland. Coastal gun batteries. Multiple batteries knocked out or disrupted, reducing fire on landing forces. German communications. Telephone lines cut, command posts attacked, creating confusion that delayed German responses for critical hours. The cost was substantial. By the end of D-Day, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had suffered approximately 2,500 casualties, roughly 20% of the force. But they had achieved their missions and contributed directly to the success of the beach landings. More significantly, they had survived. German doctrine after Crete held that 30% losses were inevitable in airborne operations, and that scattered forces couldn't accomplish missions. American forces had suffered lower casualties while completing objectives. The predictions of tactical impossibility had been proven wrong. The German perspective: confusion and defeat. German commanders facing the airborne assault struggled to understand what was happening. The scattered landings across such a wide area defied their expectations of how airborne operations should unfold. Generalleutnant Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff for 7th Army, attempted to assess the situation at 0200 hours. Reports indicate American parachute troops landing across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. Numbers unknown, objectives unclear. Units are engaging scattered groups, but cannot determine the main effort. The dispersion appears accidental, but is creating maximum confusion. By dawn, German assessment shifted from viewing dispersion as American failure to recognizing it as deliberate strategy. An after-action report from 91st Infantry Division noted, "American airborne tactics differ fundamentally from our Crete operation. They deliberately scatter forces across wide areas, creating the impression of larger forces and forcing us to defend everywhere simultaneously. Small groups operating independently achieve objectives that should require battalion-sized organized units. Their training and initiative allow effective action despite lack of formal organization." Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in the West, was in Germany on D-Day, but later reviewed airborne operations extensively. His July 1944 assessment was candid. The American airborne assault succeeded despite conditions that should have led to disaster. Their willingness to accept dispersion as tactical reality rather than failure, combined with exceptional training that allows soldiers to function independently, created effectiveness that our doctrine did not anticipate. The airborne landings delayed our response to the beach landings by critical hours and prevented us from concentrating armor for counterattacks. The larger operations, Operation Market Garden and Varsity. The success of D-Day airborne operations validated the concept, leading to even larger operations. Operation Market Garden in September 1944 attempted to seize bridges across Holland using 3 airborne divisions, the most ambitious airborne operation of the war.
Market Garden's partial failure. British airborne forces at Arnhem were destroyed, though American divisions achieved their objectives, demonstrated airborne limitations, but didn't invalidate the concept. Operation Varsity, March 1945, incorporated lessons learned. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine River, a one-day airborne operation by two divisions, American 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne, secured key terrain and disrupted German defenses. The operation was conducted in daylight, in close coordination with ground forces, with link-up accomplished within hours. It succeeded completely, demonstrating that proper employment of airborne forces remained tactically valuable even late in the war. The statistical accounting. The complete record of American airborne operations in Europe demonstrated effectiveness that pre-war skeptics had deemed impossible.
D-Day, Normandy. Troops committed 13,000, 82nd and 101st Airborne. Casualties, 2,500, 19%. Primary objectives achieved, 85%. Strategic impact, critical to beach landing success. Operation Dragoon, Southern France. Troops committed, 9,700, 1st Airborne Task Force. Casualties, 450, 5%. Objectives achieved, 100%. Strategic impact, secured invasion flanks. Market Garden, Holland. Troops committed, 34,600, 101st, 82nd, British 1st Airborne, Polish Brigade. Casualties, 11,850, 34%. Objectives achieved, 60%. Arnhem failed, other objectives taken. Strategic impact, mixed, gained territory, but failed to cross Rhine. Varsity, Rhine crossing. Troops committed, 21,680, 17th Airborne, British 6th Airborne. Casualties, 2,700, 12%. Objectives achieved, 100%. Strategic impact, significant, secured Rhine bridgehead. Total American airborne casualties, European theater. Killed in action, 3,974. Wounded, 14,550. Missing or captured, 5,600. Total, 24,124 casualties. These statistics, while sobering, were far below the catastrophic levels predicted by critics of airborne operations. The 20% average casualty rate across major operations was serious but acceptable compared to the strategic value achieved. More importantly, airborne forces consistently accomplished missions that conventional forces couldn't achieve or would have required much higher casualties to complete. The post-war legacy. The success of American airborne operations in World War II established airborne forces as permanent components of modern militaries. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions became legends, their combat record justifying continued investment in airborne capabilities. The Korean War saw airborne operations continue, though on smaller scales. The 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team conducted successful jumps at Sukchon and Munsani, demonstrating that airborne capabilities remained relevant in conventional warfare. Vietnam brought helicopter assault, air mobile operations that evolved from airborne concepts. While paratroop troops were rare in Vietnam, the principle of vertical envelopment by delivering troops from the air directly onto objectives became central to American tactics. Modern airborne forces continue the traditions established in World War II. The 82nd Airborne remains America's rapid deployment force, capable of deploying anywhere in the world within 18 hours. The doctrine of using speed, surprise, and aggressive action to achieve objectives behind enemy lines, validated over Normandy on June 6, 1944, remains central to airborne operations. Conclusion: the impossible made routine. When General Oberst Kurt Student declared after Crete that large-scale airborne operations were obsolete, he was basing his assessment on rational analysis of what his forces had experienced. The casualties were too high. The chaos was too extreme.
The tactical vulnerabilities were too severe. He was wrong because he couldn't envision how systematic training, proper mission planning, acceptance of dispersion as tactical reality, and integration with larger operations could transform airborne assault from suicide mission into effective strategy. The 13,000 American paratroopers who jumped into Normandy on the night of June 5–6, 1944, proved that what German experts declared impossible was not only possible but strategic decisive. They landed scattered across 25 miles of occupied France, organized themselves in darkness under enemy fire, achieved their objectives despite being under strength and disorganized, and held critical terrain until relieved by seaborne forces. Private Leonard Griffing, whose nervous equipment checks opened this story, survived D-Day and continued fighting through Holland and into Germany. In a 1988 interview, he reflected on that night. "We knew people said it couldn't be done, dropping thousands of men behind enemy lines, expecting them to accomplish missions while scattered and surrounded. All the experts said it was suicide, but we'd trained for it, we believed we could do it, and we did. The German generals were wrong, the military experts were wrong. We proved that with proper training and determination, American soldiers could do what everyone said was impossible. That's what we learned that night over Normandy. That sometimes the best way to do the impossible is to just go ahead and do it anyway." The airborne assault on D-Day wasn't perfect. The drop was scattered. Casualties were substantial. Many objectives weren't achieved exactly as planned. But the operation succeeded strategically, contributed critically to the invasion's success, and proved that airborne warfare, when properly planned and executed, could achieve results that conventional operations couldn't match. The German commanders who declared airborne assault was suicide learned that American training, doctrine, and execution could transform their theoretical impossibility into operational reality. The airborne troopers falling from the sky over Normandy weren't committing suicide. They were writing the future of warfare, one objective achieved at a time, proving that vertical envelopment wasn't a romantic fantasy, but a tactical reality that would shape military operations for generations to come.